Let's talk about guiding in astrophotography. And this video truly aims at being a beginner's guide, like beginner to advanced guide for autoguiding, covering everything you would wish to know about autoguiding. So it might be a bit long, but I'll make sure to have chapters down below. And whenever you have a question about guiding, you can refer back to this video. At least that's the hope. So we're going to talk about autoguiding. And if you're doing astrophotography and you end up like falling into the black hole and you have a setup like this one, or maybe just a refractor, smaller telescope, but you're still using like a tracking mount like this one that's equatorial, meaning one of its axes is pointed to the celestial pole, then you either already are using autoguiding or you wish you were. So let me quickly explain a bit before I go too much into the deep end about tracking and about the necessity for autoguiding. So here we have an equatorial mount. This equatorial mount, as I mentioned just earlier, one of its axes, specifically the right ascension axis, also known as RA axis, is pointed to the celestial pole. For me, in the northern hemisphere, it's roughly 1 degree away from the star Polaris. And the Earth obviously rotates along that axis that goes through the celestial poles of the Earth. And our job, and really the only job of this mount, like once it is pointed at a target, it's to counter the rotation of the Earth, because the Earth will rotate. And because the Earth rotates, from our point of view, the stars in the skies rotate, and we need to track the stars, basically counter the Earth's rotation. And that Earth's rotation is just like a fixed value per minute, or a fixed value, a fixed number of degrees, a fixed angle per unit of time. So how hard can it be for us humans, so advanced in technology, to basically track at a constant rate throughout the night? It should be very easy, and no, it is not. So the problem comes with the mechanics of the mounts themselves. This particular mount is called a strain wave gear mount. There's a more traditional type of mount that relies on a mechanism called a worm gear kind of drive. And in that gear, specifically the worm gear, any small deviation from the ideal shape of the worm, even a few microns, is enough to mess up the tracking of the mounts. Also, there's other issues such as atmospheric refraction, because sure, the Earth rotates at an exact rate per unit of time in terms of angular speed, but we have the atmosphere. So if a star is right above us, it goes through less atmosphere to reach our telescope. Or if the star is towards the horizon, it has to traverse more atmosphere. And this actually changes the position of the star from our point of view. And so we cannot track just by countering the rotation of the Earth. We need to be smarter than that. You have some very expensive mounts that use a combination of absolute encoders together with a sky model that can counter both rotation of the Earth, atmospheric rotation, etc., and then can track extremely precisely your target without needing anything more. And if you have one of those mounts, great, you don't need to watch this video. But chances are that you do not, and I don't either. And so in that case, we have another way to basically make sure that the mount, despite its imprecisions, keeps tracking the stars perfectly throughout the night, and it is to use a feedback loop to the mount. One way to do that is to use a small, tiny telescope. So this black and red part is a tiny telescope, and the blue part is a tiny camera. See, the camera is there. This is a little telescope, and what we do is we simply mount this tiny telescope and camera on top of the main telescope and camera. So, pop, we put it on, and the only role of that telescope and camera will be to keep track of the star. And if it sees that we deviate away from the star, it will tell the control center, which will tell the mount, like, hey, no. Go a little bit faster or slower, or move in this direction a little bit, or move in that direction a little bit, etc. So it's a reactive type of loop. We see a small deviation in this little tiny scope, and then we tell the mount to correct for that deviation. But that way, we can prevent any runaway deviation from the target. We can keep our deviations as small as possible, and effectively as small as the guide scope here is able to detect, and as small as the mount is able to react to it. So that is auto-guiding in a word. The simplest way to do auto-guiding is using a guide camera and a guide scope. It's exactly as I mentioned. I'll have links to various cameras and scopes down in the description if you're interested. But basically, you typically have a holder. It's behind the camera here, behind the scope. You can't really see it, but there you typically have a holder for this kind of dovetail here on the telescope that you buy. So it's just a matter of putting it in, connecting the camera, and you're good to go. You have to focus, you have to use imaging software, but we'll get to that later in the video. And this type of setup for auto-guiding is excellent, especially if you have a low focal length telescope, like a small refracting telescope. And it has a couple of issues. The issue is that this tiny telescope, it's much smaller than the main telescope, and therefore it has usually less focal length. This means it zooms in less, meaning that small deviations, like this little scope is tracking a star and tries to see the star deviating, and the star actually does deviate, and it does impact the main scope. But this tiny scope, because it doesn't zoom in far enough, it doesn't notice anything, so it doesn't say anything, and that's a bit of an issue. Then we're not reacting fast enough. That is one of the issues that you can have with this type of guide scope. Another issue is that because the guide scope is attached on top of the telescope, it's independent from the main telescope. And you can have a phenomenon that is called flexure, which can happen, especially if you take long exposures with the main telescope. Let's say your main telescope is taking 5-minute exposure, and it's rotating, slowly to counter the rotation of the Earth. While it's rotating, gravity impacts this tiny scope, and it could impact it in a way that very slightly something along the way bends. And it doesn't have to be within the scope or the foot of the guide scope. It can even be something like here, in this area, something bends during the exposure. Our guide scope has no idea about that. It cannot correct for that. And so if you ever use a tiny guide scope like that with a guide camera, and you see that you have good guiding, your guiding figures are fine, and despite that you see that your long exposures have trailing stars, then maybe one cause could be flexure between the guide scope and the main imaging camera. Or there are other things that can happen as well. I mentioned like flexure in the imaging train here. If you're using a Schmidt-Cassegrain type of telescope, the primary mirror that's at the back of the telescope can actually float a little bit and tilt very slightly during exposure. That's something else that the guide scope has no idea about and cannot correct for. There can be another source of star trailing if you have good guiding figures. It is simply if you're using cooled astrophotography camera and the fan is spinning in a way that it causes vibration. That could actually also be a root cause for that. So don't immediately blame your guiding setup for this issue. You want to investigate a little bit. But while I'm here, let me show you, this is another setup. It's called an off-axis guider, or OAG for short. And the way that it works is that you can see we have the main camera sensor at the back, and here at the very top, above the main camera sensor, there is a tiny little mirror, actually a tiny little prism, that catches a little bit of the light that comes from the telescope and redirects it towards the top here. And at the top, what do we have here? We have a tiny little guide camera. This camera, by the way, is the ASI 220 Mini. It's excellent. I really like this tiny camera. I'll go into the choice of guide scope and camera in a moment, but I'll put links again in the video description. So when you're using an off-axis guider like that, you are using the main telescope to guide. So the drawbacks of the independent guide scope and camera, they're nullified. We track with the main telescope, so we have the same focal length as the telescope. So any tracking error that can be detected and thus affect the main image will also be detected by this little tiny camera there. So that's one problem solved. Second problem is solved, it's flexure. Flexure is also solved because we are so close, the main camera and the guide camera, they're basically paired together. If there's any flexure somewhere in the system, they affect both. And therefore, in this kind of setup, the guide camera with its off-axis guider can actually correct for the flexure it can correct for mirror shift during exposure, and it can correct for tracking error. It can correct for a lot of things. The most difficult part of an off-axis guider is basically making sure that the distance between that tiny prism there at the back and the sensor from the guide camera, as well as the distance from the plane where that prism is reflecting light to the main sensor is exactly the same. Otherwise, those two cameras cannot be in focus at the same time. It has another drawback. Do you know, like you can see, I have my guide camera here with the off-axis guider. Behind it, I have my filter drawer in between the off-axis guider and the camera. So remember what happens if I go from no filter at all to adding a filter in between. I put a filter in my filter drawer and I insert it in there. The focus point of the main camera sensor will have changed. So we'll need to adjust the focus. While I do that, the distance that I just mentioned from the guide camera to the prism doesn't change. Therefore, the main imaging sensor will be in focus, but suddenly the guide sensor will not be in focus anymore, which will cause issues with the tracking. We have another issue as well. You see the prism is towards the edge there. So if your telescope does not have an imaging circle that is large enough to cover your tiny prism there, then the prism will not receive enough light and you will not see stars. And the guide camera won't be able to see star and it doesn't work. And similarly, if you have a very long focal length telescope like a Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope with 1500 millimeters, 2000 millimeters, 2900 millimeters focal length that zooms in a lot, then it's very possible for your little guide camera here to simply not see any stars because you are zooming in so much that there's no stars available with the sensitivity of that camera, and we're not able to guide. So that's the trouble we can have with off-axis guiders. It solves some issues, some very important issues, but at the same time, it introduces new potential issues. And there is a third way to do guiding that is very similar to the off-axis guider, and that is using a camera that has both the main imaging sensor and the guide chip integrated. So this is the case with this camera here. You can see we have the main sensor here, and then above it, there's a tiny secondary sensor that is the guide sensor. Interestingly enough, it is also a 220 sensor, so it has the same sensor as that red camera that I showed you a moment earlier. And with that, basically, both the main camera sensor and the guide sensor on top of it are integrated within the camera, and they're also always at the same plane. You have a tiny little like focus knob here at the top to adjust the fine focus of the guide sensor. And because of that, it fixes one of the issues that I mentioned earlier, which is what if you add a filter in the imaging train, or you even change a filter that changes the focus point? Well, in this case, the whole camera will move back and forth to adjust for focus changes due to filters, and it affects both the guide sensor and the main sensor. So we don't care. It's not going to affect the main sensor. The problem comes, what if I use a filter like this one, which rejects a lot of light pollution, lets in a little bit of signal, but dims the stars a lot? It will make finding guide stars much more difficult than with a traditional off-axis guider that has direct access to the light right outside of the telescope without any filter in between. So yeah, you can see this solution solves one issue of that solution, but it adds a new issue at the same time. Still, it's an excellent camera. I've reviewed it on the channel. There's three camera models that have this technology these days. We have this one, which is the ESI 2600 MC Duo. It's a color camera with this dual sensor. The guide chip, by the way, is monochrome. It also has a monochrome version, so the 2600 MM Duo. So both main imaging sensor and the guide chip are monochrome. And then you also have the ZW 2600 MC Air, which is the same camera, but with an integrated Asiair control center within the camera that I've also reviewed on the channel. And I'll have all of the links in the description. But you can see it's very interesting to see that basically there's no ideal guide setup. everything has advantages and drawbacks. If you're using a small refractor, you're fine going with something like this. But if you're going towards like a Newtonian telescope, something with a longer focal length, then yeah, you may want to consider something like I have here, an off-axis guider. This particular guide camera, by the way, it's called the Autoguiding, I think, GPM462M, and it also uses a very recent sensor. I also like it a lot. It's this camera is the 220, very recent sensor. This one is the 462, also quite recent sensor. Both work really well for guiding. And that's something that I want to touch upon, the choice of the camera for guiding, because there's multiple criteria to take into account when you do that. First, if you're using a guide scope, something that's very important between the camera and the guide scope is the pixel scale. So you have tools that are available online like astronomy.tools that give you your pixel scale for your guide setup and for your primary setup. So let's say I want to check the pixel scale. So what is the pixel scale? It is basically a combination of your pixel size of your guide camera together with the focal length of your main telescope to determine how much detail any given pixel can detect. When you're doing guiding, you'll have like sub-pixel guiding, that kind of stuff that makes it better, and it will be the reason for the 5 times rule that I'll give in a moment. But basically, I have this tiny little scope. This is the ZW 30mm f4 mini guide scope, and let's say I was using it with the ASI 220 mini, so that red camera here. I would compute the pixel scale on Astronomy Tools. You can see in there, I would go to imaging mode, I choose any random Messier object, I put in the focal length of the guide scope, and I put in my camera in there. Now, the only thing that really matters is the focal length and the pixel size. Anything else, you can choose anything else. It's not going to affect what interests us. And once you have that, you can look at the bottom, and you can see a resolution field here, which is 6.88 arc seconds per pixel. Remember that. Let's round it up to 7 arc seconds per pixel. Now we do need to do the same thing with our main telescope. So the main telescope uses an IMX571 sensor, which is the same as this one, the ASI 2600mm MC, and it has indeed pixel size of 3.76 microns. It also has a focal length of 580 millimeters, and now we can see that the resolution is 1.34 arc seconds compared to 7 earlier. So let's do 1.34 times 5. And you can see 1.34 times 5 is equal to 6.7. Okay, so this is the 5 times rule that I mentioned. This is a guideline, generally, about if you're using a guide scope with a guide camera, you want to have at most a ratio of 5 times between the resolution of your main equipment and the resolution of our guide scope and camera. In this case, we are exactly at 5 times. So it works, barely, but it works, and we're good. Now, it's a guideline. You can exceed it or not. It's up to you. But that's like a general rule of thumb about that. And so I recommend, if you're going to use an external guide scope, to do that exercise to verify that when you choose both the guide scope and your guide camera, it fits in to that 5 times kind of rule of thumb compared to the pixel scale, that resolution, those arc seconds per pixel that you get with the main imager here. And there's also other stuff that you want to take into account when you're choosing a guide camera. If you're using an off-axis guider, you want to make sure that if you're using a guide camera with a large sensor, like the 174mm camera that has a huge sensor with large pixels, then you want to make sure that you have an off-axis guider with a large prism that can reflect a lot of that light and actually cover the field of view of that sensor. With a camera that has a huge sensor and large pixels, this is actually great for off-axis guiders using telescopes that have a very long focal length, because then you have a larger field of view in your guide camera, so you can find more stars in a situation where you're zooming in so much that stars are difficult to find. So that's one thing. If you're using a Schmidt-Cassegrain, you want to look for an off-axis guider that has a large prism and a camera that has a large sensor. If you use a camera with a large sensor, a guide camera with a large sensor, together with this off-axis guider that has only, I think, a 7 or 8 millimeter prism, then you'll see some vignetting on your guide camera, and that large sensor will somewhat go to waste. So that's something to take into account. Also to take into account is the pixel size, but that's simply due to the image scale. So we've already actually taken into account the pixel size of your guide camera by using the 5 times rule earlier. One other thing as well is the type of camera. If at all possible, make sure that you use a monochrome camera rather than a color camera for guiding. In general, monochrome will work better. It has simply more sensitivity and also more native, effectively, resolution compared to a color camera. Guiding will still work with a color camera, but it will be slightly less good. There's one more thing you want to consider when you're taking a guide camera. Ideally, you want to make sure that it's actually made for guiding, meaning it has a body like this one with a 1.25-inch eyepiece type of barrel, so you can actually fit it into the off-axis guider very well. By the way, when you fit it into the off-axis guider, make sure that the long side of the sensor matches the long side of that little window to the prism that is below. And quickly talking about off-axis guiders, I have a longer video about exactly how to set up your prism, etc. when you're using an off-axis guider. So I'll put a link to that video down below if you're interested in really going into nitty-gritty details. If I really go into everything in this video, it's going to be hours and hours long. Okay, but let's say now you've restricted your choice to 2 very solid cameras, this ASI 220 Mini for guiding using the 220 sensor, monochrome. And then there is this Autoguiding camera here, the GPM 462, which is also monochrome with a recent sensor, the 462 monochrome sensor. So how do you choose between the two? In the end, it's not going to make a big difference, but something you may want to have a look at is the sensitivity in the infrared bandpass, or near infrared, NIR. Basically, the reason for that is that if you have an atmosphere that is very turbulent and you have very poor seeing, basically like if in your sky, when you look at stars, they twinkling a lot, those stars, that means you have poor seeing. That means the atmosphere is turbulent. This is very typical in Japan, where we have the jet stream passing overhead. So we have very bad seeing all of the time. And the problem with atmospheric seeing is that it makes the apparent position of the star move a little bit very quickly through time. And what's going to happen is that if you have a guide camera with a guide scope or off-axis guider, or the ZW2600MC Duo, for instance, pointed at a star and tracking a star to tell the mount, like, hey, you're tracking bad, go correct this in this direction, kind of stuff, they could look at the star, see that it has moved a little bit, tell the mount to track that, and then the next guide exposure it takes, it's like, oh, never mind, it hadn't moved actually. And then the mount is confused. And what the reason for that could be the seeing, the atmospheric turbulence that makes the apparent position of the star move a tiny bit. And in that case, because the changes in the movement of the stars are very fast, high frequency kind of changes, and your guide camera is set up together with your software to kind of like try to chase those changes, it's actually bad for the image because we are chasing movements of the stars that are actually not relevant, that we shouldn't be chasing. And that's called chasing the seeing when you're doing auto guiding. One way to avoid that is to image or use near infrared filters on your guide cameras, because infrared is much less affected by atmospheric seeing than other wavelengths. And you have some filters available to do that. Like you have the Batter 685 nanometer filter that basically lets in only light past or redder than 685 nanometers. You even have the ZW 850 where it's even, worse, it's even more in the infrared. From 850 nanometers and above, it passes the light. And then the question becomes, how sensitive is your guide camera to infrared? And if I look, for instance, at the page of the ASI 220mm Mini, and we can look at the charts, and you can see we have a chart of wavelengths on the x-axis compared to the quantum efficiency of the camera on the y-axis. The higher, the more sensitive the camera is. And you can see the more we go into the infrared, the less sensitive it becomes. At between above 850, it's around 40 to even 15% sensitive. It will still work, but it's not that sensitive in infrared or near infrared. If by contrast, I have a look at the Autoguiding camera that I have there, with the 462 sensor, we can see that from 850, it's still at 80% transmission, and at 1000, it's still above 30% transmission. So for near infrared, that particular camera sensor might be better, or actually is better. Now, do you need to use near infrared or not? That's an entirely different question. It's just, it leaves open the possibility for using infrared guiding. So again, I'll have all of those links in the description. In general, if you haven't bought a main imaging camera, you don't have your full setup yet, and you're getting into astrophotography or building your setup, I would recommend, or I would say, not recommend, but I will say that the ZW duo type of cameras, or the ASI 2600 and MC Air, they work really well having the guide chip integrated. It's one less thing, to think about. It's integrated, it works, you don't need to worry about it. Otherwise, if you're using a small refracting telescope, let's say 500 millimeters focal length or less, you're perfectly fine with a guide scope and guide camera. Guide camera, I would recommend the ASI 220 or that 462 from TopeTech. They both will work very well with such a guide scope. And if you're using something larger, from a Newtonian to a Schmidt-Cassegrain, you can still use guide scopes and guide cameras. But I've seen that off-axis guiders, they really solve a lot of problems. It's just the initial setup of the off-axis guider is a bit difficult with, that plane of focus that should match between the main imaging sensor and the guide camera. Okay, so now we're done with, the equipment side of things. How you can do, why we do guiding, how you can do it, which camera to choose, the 5 times rules between the resolution of your main telescope and the one of your guide scope if you're using a guide scope. Let's talk about the software that's going to be used to control your guide camera, take the feedback from the guide camera and send it to the mount. If you're using a Windows type of system, then you will most likely use PHD2, which stands for Push Here Dummy, because it's supposed to be like one click and it works. If you're using a ZW ASI camera with a fully ZW setup, then you may be using the ZW ASI Air that also uses PHD2, but it's a stripped down version of the same software. So I will be covering both of those, how to effectively set them up, how to get your guide camera into focus, how to decide on your guide parameters like the exposure length, etc., and then how to actually start guiding, look at the results, and determine if there's an issue with the results. So there's still a lot to go. Again, I have all of the chapters down in the description. Obviously, creating those videos is a lot of work, so if you appreciate that work, you can go down below, click that like button. It really helps the channel out. And if you have any tips and tricks about guiding, feedback about this video, you just want to say hello, whatever, you can leave a comment down below, and it also helps the channel out a lot. If you're new to the channel and you like astrophotography, I would recommend you subscribe to the channel using that little subscribe button. You can click that bell icon as well to be notified when I publish other videos. And if you want to support the channel even more at no cost to you, and you're planning on buying any equipment from Amazon or Agena or High Point Scientific, First Light Optics, etc., if you do so after clicking the links that I have down in the description, it will help me out at no cost to you, and your support is much appreciated. If you want to sponsor this channel directly, because yes, this video is sponsored by my Patreon supporters and channel members, well, you can become a Patreon supporter. Link is down in the description. Or a channel member is the join button next to that subscribe button. And you guys, you know it, you are my channel sponsor. You are sponsoring this video. You are making astrophotography better by your contributions. So thank you so much for your generosity. It really means the world. Anyway, with that, I'm gonna wait for a clear night so I can actually show you the guiding software, how to configure it, and put it in action. So see you then. Okay, so now that we've set up our guide setup, whether you went with a guide scope, an off-axis guider, or a camera like I have here that has both a main imaging sensor and a separate guide imaging sensor, we are ready to look at how we can set up our guiding software. And I'm going to start with the ASI Air. So this is the 2600 MC Air camera from ZW, and it comes with the Asiair integrated. So let me show you how to set up the guiding for that. So it all starts actually in the very first screen that you get when you connect to the Asiair after you've turned it on, and you want to make sure that your main camera is your main camera sensor, and that your guide camera, you've selected it so that it's indeed the guide camera that is connected via USB to your setup. And one thing that is extremely important is the focal length for the main telescope and the guide telescope. So this is the Red Cat 51. It has a focal length of 250 millimeters, and actually, according to the plate solving done by the Asiair, its effective focal length right now is 248 millimeters, which is fine. And because in this particular setup, I'm not using a separate guide scope, I am guiding through the main imaging telescope, I will be using the same focal length for the main telescope and the guide telescope. So you can see I have 248 on one side, and I'll put 248 in the other side as well. And this is critical because if you have the wrong focal length for your guide scope, then the figures in arc seconds in terms of the guiding stability and the guiding performance will be incorrect. So it's very important to get that right. Once you're done and once you're ready, you can enter the interface as usual. Okay, and now that you're in there, I have my mount connected. So this is the UMI 17 Lite by Proxy Sky. I have everything connected, and this little pane there is actually the guiding interface. So I can click on the double arrow to open it up, and it tells me a little tutorial. Tap here to set the exposure of the guide camera, tap here to start image looping, and tap here to start the guide. And you can check the guiding graph and adjust the settings in here. Okay, so looking at this interface, what do we see? Well, we'll see a ton of parameters, including this button at the top right, which is showing me what calibration I had achieved last time I used the guiding. The calibration is an initial step that the program does. It moves the telescope in very specific directions, in very specific steps, and then it verifies on the image in which direction it has moved. And that way it can calibrate, okay, if I tell the telescope to move in this direction, it moves the pixels in that direction. It maps out the movements of the telescope to what the software sees on the guide chip. And that's a very important thing. We also have a way to start the exposures. It's the double, like the circle arrow there. This starts taking the exposures, and right now the exposures are 3 seconds long. I could change that to say like, okay, no, right now we'll put them 1 second long. And then at the very bottom, we'll have a guide graph, which is available here. It will tell you your performance in terms of guiding for both right ascension and declination. You'll have this figure is the total guiding error. If it's 1 arc second, 1 arc seconds or better, it's usually very good for any setup that you may be using. And then you have parameters like the RA aggressiveness and the declination aggressiveness that basically determine how much, like if the guide chip sees that your star has drifted by 5 pixels and it thinks that it can fix that by telling the mount to move for, let's say, 200 milliseconds in this direction, then instead of doing 200 milliseconds, it will give the mount an instruction to do this movement for 200 milliseconds times the percentage that we have here. So if I had like the declination aggressiveness to 60%, if the guide chip had seen a movement that should warrant a 200 milliseconds kind of movement by the mount, it will actually send a command for 60% of that, 120 milliseconds. That's what the aggressiveness here means. For my particular mount, those values actually work well. And by the way, there are some things as well that are available within the settings of the Asiair. So if I go to the information button at the top right, and then I choose this little icon there, it gives me some guiding parameters, like the guide scope focal length, which we've already set. And things like the max dec duration, max RA duration, keep them at their default. This is usually fine. And you have some important stuff like the calibration step. So we'll see once we do calibration. So if I go back to the guiding window to this calibration thing, you'll see the telescope move a certain number of steps in one direction and then another number of steps in a direction perpendicular to the first one. Ideally, we should see around 12 steps per direction. if when you're doing the calibration, you see you only have like 3 steps or 2 steps or 5 steps, something like that, you can go to your settings there, go to the guide settings and set this calibration step to something lower. So if you only had 6 steps, for instance, if you had 2000 milliseconds in there, if you lower it to 1000 milliseconds, automatically you will have 12 steps. And you can just clear the calibration and then try again. So that's an important parameter. And the default works well for a lot of setups, but sometimes it's not good enough. So this is something we want to keep in mind. There's 2 other things: auto restore calibration and auto flip the deck output after the meridian. Auto restore calibration basically says like, okay, once you've done the calibration once, remember it and reuse it so it doesn't need to recalibrate every single time. If you're using your guide camera connected directly to your control center, like the Asiair here, and not connected to your mount via an ST4 cable, then you absolutely should use that. It is extremely convenient to not have to recalibrate every single time. The second one, auto flip the deck output after the meridian, actually depends pretty much solely on your mount. Some mounts require this to be on, some mounts require this to be off. Most mounts actually require it to be off. This one does. The EM5 also does require it to be off. The Warp Astron WD20, for instance, requires it to be on. So that depends on your mount. The main symptom you would see is that you look at your guide chart, and after the meridian, if you see the red line go suddenly further and further and further away, let's say in the down direction, in this direction, and while you see pulses going in the upwards direction, it means that your pulses are actually, moving detonation away from where it should be instead of pulling it back to the center. That's a dead giveaway that you need to actually flip the declination after the meridian flip. So that's also something to keep in mind. Within those guiding parameters, we also have advanced settings, but we can have a quick look at what's in there. You have guide stability and dither, and those 2 are actually related. The dither operation is every few frames, you can tell your mount to move a little tiny bit. And you should absolutely dither if you have the ability to do so, because it helps improve the quality of your final image a lot, and I've done a lot of videos about that. So you can go inside the dither settings and say how many pixels you want to dither by. This is the distance there, and then how many frames do you want to take before you do a dither. So if you set this interval to 1, every frame, once the main imaging camera has taken an image, it will dither and then start another image. And then once that other image is finished, it will dither and then start another image, etc., etc. So that's the interval there. And the distance is the distance in pixel for the guide camera, for the guide sensor, how many pixels to move each dither. And you typically want, my personal preference is to move by around 20% of the main imaging sensor. And so it can get a bit complicated, but basically my main imaging sensor has pixel size of 3.76, and I believe that within here the guide camera or the guide sensor has a pixel size of 4 micrometers. So they're very similar, which means that if I want to move the main imaging camera between each exposure by roughly 10 to 20 pixels, I should be selecting this. Yeah, this would work. Roughly, that would give me, because 4 micrometers to 3.76, probably 12, 13 pixels on the main imaging camera, and that works pretty well. And if you have other setups, you need to do the computations like, okay, if my guide chip moves by 5 pixels, how many pixels will my main imaging camera move by? So that's something that you need to compute. And if you're using a separate guide scope, you need to come back to those measurements that I showed earlier in terms of the number of arc seconds per pixels and use that to measure how many pixels your main imaging camera would move for a movement of X pixels of your guide camera. So for example, if your main imaging camera has a resolution of 1 arc second per pixel, but your guide camera has 5 arc seconds per pixel, it means that for every pixel that is moved on your guide camera, the main camera sees a movement of 5 pixels, right? So it's a way of, figuring out that kind of stuff. And then you have the final option there, dither only in RA. You want to ignore that unless you're using some like star tracker that can only move in RA, that kind of stuff. Okay, and now that we've talked about the dither, let's talk about the guide stability. Basically, what's going to happen is, right now I'm telling this setup that after every exposure on the main camera, I will want to dither by 10 pixels on the guide camera. And after it has dithered, it moves the telescope, right? So it needs to kind of wait for the telescope to settle down and then track properly again. And the criteria for determining that your mount has now settled and is ready to guide properly so you can start a new image on your main imaging sensor is this. It tells you, like, stability is basically saying, like, okay, if I see that that the mount is now tracking at less than 2 arc seconds precision, or better than 2 arc seconds precision, and it maintains that for 5 seconds or more, then I can start taking my next image using the main imaging sensor. That is what this means. And then you have a timeout there that, let's say, if those 2 criteria are never met, then after 60 seconds, never mind, just go on, image away, I don't care anymore. That is what those settings mean. Then we have things like dark library. You can take dark frames for your guide camera to get better results. You can also bin your guide camera by a factor of 2. This lets you have like more sensitivity per exposure. It can be useful if you have short exposures and you need to detect more stars. So that can be a weapon to use, because then you'll be able to detect more stars, but you're also decreasing the resolution of your guide camera. If your guide camera was 5 arc seconds per pixel, if you enable that setting, it will then be 10 arc seconds per pixel. And that completely changes the ratio that I was talking about between the guide camera and guide scope pixel scale and then the main imaging camera pixel scale. So this needs to be used judiciously and thinking about it while you're enabling that. So those are the advanced settings that I wanted to talk about a little bit. Okay, so I'm still in the guide screen. What I'll do is I'll go to my calibration and clear it so that I will need to recalibrate next time. And now when you want to do your calibration, ideally you want to point to a star or a set of stars that is not too far from the celestial equator. And in my case, I'm just going to try Altair, so I can exit the guide mode, go to a target, say that I want to go to Altair. There we go. And say go to. Then let's wait for the mount to reach this position. Okay, and we are now on target. I want to make sure that we are focused, because I will want to make sure that the guide chip is actually well focused to the main camera, because we're having like both kind of related to one another, just like an off-axis guider. Because now I need to make sure that my guide camera is well focused before we can go on. So ideally, I would actually first launch an autofocus with the Asiair, and that's what I'm going to do. It's necessary if you have something like the Duo or the 2600 MC Air, or if you're using an off-axis guider, because then both your guide camera and your main camera use the same telescope to image and to guide. If you have a separate guide scope, then you don't need to focus the main telescope before you focus the guide camera. You can focus the guide camera separately. So for now, I'm just going to go to Focuser, click on Autofocus, and just do one set of autofocus just to have the main camera super well focused, and then I can adapt the guide camera to have also best focus where the camera also has best focus. So let's wait for that to complete. Okay, and the autofocus is complete, and I can go back to the guide screen and take exposures. And this is something that I actually really don't like with how the Asiair works, is that as far as I know, there's no way to zoom into the guide image. So it's very difficult to see whether the stars are in focus. I noticed that on the left, next to the graph icon there, I can see a star. It's reasonably in focus. But anyway, you can see that I am basically using the double arrows to loop exposures. And by the way, within this telescope, I have a dual band narrowband filter. So this is really kind of the worst case scenario for guiding via a ZWM ASI 2600 MC Duo or Air like what I have here. What's going to happen is that I can either tap on a star, so I could tap this star and then click on the guide icon that's right above the stop icon, and maybe using that little chart on the right, I can try and adjust the focus and see what happens. And actually that worked really well. So, however, with this star selected, if I click on the guide button, it will guide only using this star. And this is a big difference between single star guiding and multi-star guiding. If you do a single star guiding, you are relying on a single star. You can see on the screen it's moving around quite a lot. That's due to the atmospheric seeing. And if you're taking short exposures like 1 second, which this mount requires, like pretty much every other strain wave gear mount, then you will be chasing the seeing, which is not good, as I described earlier. So what you want to do instead is you want to make sure that you guide with multiple stars, because then you have multiple points of reference that you can average out to try and not chase the seeing. And for that, you want to make sure that you do not have a star selected in the guide screen. So I'm going to stop the exposures, start them again. So now that I have nothing selected, I can click on the guide button right above the stop button. I've also adjusted the exposure to 2 seconds simply because 1 second didn't give me enough stars, but I'll click on the guide button and now we will start. You can see it has selected multiple stars, and you can see west step 1, distant 0, west step 2, distant 8, west step 3, distance 17, west, and now east step 3. So you can see it uses only 3 steps for west, and then it's going to use 3 steps for east. I'm going to stop that. This is not good. I'm going to stop that, go to the guide parameters. So there we go. And I want to make sure that my calibration step, we got only 3 steps. I want roughly 4 times more. So instead of 2000, I'm going to divide by 4 and say 500 as the calibration step. And now we can go back to the guiding, take back the exposures, and I'm going to start guiding again. And we'll have our calibration process that will come in. So now, west step 1, and now you can see the distance between steps is much smaller, maybe even too small. You be the judge, but you can let it be. And now suddenly we're having much more steps than we did before, which will make for a higher quality calibration. So there you go. That's with this calibration step and how important it is. Let's wait until it's done. We have actually 14 steps, 15 steps. Okay, maybe a bit too many. East is fine. It can use fewer steps for east. But, you know, it worked well with 15 steps. I could probably increase the calibration step to like 700 milliseconds to have just the right amount of steps. But otherwise, this is perfectly fine. And you can see, you need to make sure that you're not moving around, pushing the telescope. You need to leave everything on its own while it's doing the calibration. And you let it be. Again, it's doing the calibration for the north step. So we see 8, 9, we'll probably see around 15 steps again, which is perfectly fine. And now it is ready. It has done its calibration and it is starting to guide. So we can see the actual guide results. Now I'm standing right next to the telescope. I'm moving around, I'm talking. This makes my balcony vibrate. So we're going to see probably terrible results, but you can see effectively you get 2 charts, one red, one blue. The blue is for the right ascension, basically the pure tracking of the star, and the declination is the axis 90 degrees to that. It's just used when you have not so good polar alignment, which reminds me, I actually did not polar align this mount. I just like plopped it on the balcony, no polar alignment whatsoever. So I would expect to get normally terrible results, but because it's a strain wave gear, it can react very quickly. We're still getting like excellent guiding figures with just 0.6 roughly right now. The red one is declination, everything is going peachy. You can see that this is actually working really, really well as it is. And in this chart, basically, the more the lines, blue and red, are towards the center, the better. You can also check by clicking on corrections. The small like bars that you see on the chart are the corrections that are being sent by the Asiair to the mount to tell it to like, you know, stay on center. So right now it saw like declination like veered away, so it tells declination to go back. And actually you can see declination has a tendency to go below the middle line, and this is very likely due to a very poor polar alignment that you have. That's a very typical symptom of a poor polar alignment, like declination that veers completely off course. I'm going to stop the guiding for now because this is pretty much all there is for the Asiair in terms of guiding. Last thing you can do is just tap on the top right icon to look at your calibration. For me, this calibration actually looks a little bit weird because the axes are not perpendicular to one another. So there's probably something funky going on. I was right next to the scope, vibrating everything while talking and agitating myself, so I'm not surprised. And I really don't care if the calibration... Oh, and of course, I'm completely off polar alignment, so that definitely has an impact. So yeah, remember to be well polar aligned before you do your calibration. If you see something like that and you're well polar aligned, you probably want to redo your calibration so you clear the results and have it redone. And so that's basically it for guiding using the Asiair. I think I've gone through most of the options that are there and the things that you can move around. If in the charts you see one of the axes, right ascension or declination, that doesn't seem to go back to the center despite getting corrections, you can increase the aggressiveness for one of those axes. If on the other side of the spectrum you see, for example, your declination curve in red that goes above the chart, that goes above the middle line, then below the middle line, then above, then below, then above, then below, and each time you see a direction in the opposite side, that means that you have too much aggressiveness, and you can lower the aggressiveness to make that much smoother. But that goes really into the details of guiding, but you can see how you can play with the aggressiveness to make things work well. So that's for the Asiair, and now we can move on to PHD2 on PC, which is actually the same software as in the Asiair, but more advanced with more options. So let's have a look at that now. Before we do that, if you have any tips and tricks on the Asiair or on guiding in general, let us know down in the comments. If you want to help the channel out, you can like the video. It really helps out. It takes only 1 second. And if you want to support my work even more, because it is a lot of work to make those videos, and you're planning on buying anything from Amazon, Agena, High Point Scientific, ZW, etc., for instance, this ZW2600 MC Air, if you buy that after clicking the links that I have down in the description, it will help me out at no cost to you. And as usual, this channel is sponsored by my channel members and Patreon supporters. If you too want to make this channel possible, to sponsor this channel, to sponsor my videos, you can consider joining my Patreon. The link is down in the description, or joining as a member. It's the join button next to the subscribe button. And you guys, I say it every time, you make the difference. Thank you so much for your generosity. If you're new to the channel and you like astrophotography, you should consider subscribing. You won't regret it. Okay, with that, let's go to the PC stuff. Okay, I'm now with my second setup here that uses a PC to guide and to do all of the imaging. And it's difficult to see from you guys, but this is the main imaging camera. And right next to it, right here, I have the guide camera with a helical focuser to basically focus the guide camera. And I did exactly the same thing as I did with the Asiair. I slewed to Altair, and then I did autofocus using the main imaging camera because we're using an off-axis guider. So I want to make sure that when the main imaging camera is in focus, then the guide camera is also in focus. That's very important. So we have done those prerequisite steps already, and now is the time to work on PHD2 Guiding, which is the free software that I'll be showing to control this guide setup effectively and how to connect it with some other software, like to control the imaging. For instance, in my case, Nina, which is free and open source. Okay, so currently what I've done is I've just installed and opened PHD2 Guiding. Actually, I've installed it a while ago, but when you first launch it, you should be getting something like this, a new profile wizard. And if you don't get that, you can simply go to this USB icon at the bottom left, click there, manage profile, and you can say new using wizard. And now you'll have your wizard to determine what this equipment is. And here you'll choose first your guide camera. And for me, this is a ZW ASI 220 Mini. So I should be able to choose. I have the choice between ZW ASI camera and ASI camera ASCOM. And if you have the choice between the two, unless you have a specific reason to choose ASCOM, you should use the one without ASCOM because it uses the native drivers of the camera. Is the camera already connected to the PC? Yes. So now it's going to try to get the information from the camera, and you can see immediately it got the pixel size of 4 micrometers. And now what I need to do is I need to change the focal length of the guide scope, which is also the main telescope, and that focal length is roughly 520 millimeters. So that's very important, but you can see the steps are actually very similar than what we have in the Asiair. Then I need to click next, and now I need to tell PHD2, okay, so when you see deviation on the guide star, who do you tell? And you want to tell the mount. For me, the mount is the Warp Astron WD20. I've just updated the firmware. Now it has some cool collision avoidance features. I'll probably do a video about that. In my particular case, it is this on-step telescope ASCOM as the driver. If it was like a ZWAM5, you'd see an ASCOM ZWM5 driver, that kind of stuff. It depends on your mount. So now you get a very interesting thing, which is that within the mount itself, there's a setting that is basically called the guide rate. And it is a percentage of the sidereal rate, which is the rate at which the Earth rotates effectively. And in a lot of mounts, it defaults to 0.5 times the sidereal rate. I prefer to set mine, when possible, to 1 times sidereal rate, because I don't see why I would not take advantage of the full speed of guiding to get the fastest reactions possible. I don't see the point in reducing that number, but a lot of mounts have it set up to 0.5x by default. I do think I have set that up to be 1x, but because the mount is connected, I can try to have PHD2 get that value directly from the driver. So I'm going to say yes, and you can see, indeed, it got the value from the mount of 1 time sidereal rate. And that's exactly how I like it. Unless you have like a specific restriction from your mount, like you're not allowed to send a guide command to like move the mount less than 100 milliseconds, then yes, you may want to reduce that guide rate, because then you can, 100 milliseconds can control a smaller movement of the mount. But otherwise, let me know down in the comments if I'm wrong, if I'm missing something, but I do not see the point of having something like that is 0.x times sidereal, but that's just me. Anyway, we can click on next, and we don't have any adaptive optics, so I'm going to click on next. I don't have a rotator, so I'm going to click on next, and we can say that the name of that setup is Quattro 150p OAG. There it is. Now I'm telling it that it can build a dark library. This is to get better guiding. It's going to build a dark library based on the camera here. It's something that you saw there was the option to do in the Asiair. And also, I will set auto restore calibration just like we had in the option of the Asiair, so that I don't need to recalibrate each time. And that works when your setup does not move. If you move your guide camera in relation to your main camera, or if you're using a guide scope, a separate one, if you move the guide scope, then you need to recalibrate, that's for sure. And now I'm going to click on finish. And now immediately it opens this build dark library setup tool, and I recommend doing it. And for me, I think I'll set the max exposure time to just 3 seconds, because I never take exposures of more than 3 seconds with my guide camera. And we're going to take 5 dark frames per exposure. That helps PHD2 filter out any noise that you have from the guide camera. With older guide cameras, like the ASI 120 Mini, if you don't have dark frames, it can really do a terrible job, especially if it's on an off-axis guider. So for a lot of cameras, it's recommended. For the 220 Mini, I don't really need it, but just to demonstrate how it works. So for now, what I'll do is I'll put the dust cap of my telescope onto the main part of the telescope, so that the guide camera sees only darkness, and I'll turn off the light of my balcony, and then just click on start to show you how it looks like. Okay, we're ready, so I'm just going to click on start, and it tells me to cover the guide scope. I've already done that because the guide scope is my main telescope since we're using an off-axis guider. And I'm going to click on OK. And now it's taking, the 1 second dark frames, 3 out of 5, 4 out of 5s, and then it's going to do 1.5 seconds, and then 2 seconds, and then 2.5 seconds, and then 3 seconds, and then we will be done. So I'll let it be, and I'll see you once it's done. And we are done, and now it tells me to uncover the guide scope, which is what I am going to do. Okay? And now you can see that I have at the bottom a curve. If I close this, if you don't have it, you can go to View and Display Graph. And in there, you have the right ascension aggressiveness, the declination aggressiveness. Sounds familiar? That's because it is. We just saw it in the Asiair. We have some additional settings like the hysteresis. It's based on the algorithm that we're using to guide. And the minimum motion, like basically if you see a movement of less than 0.25 pixels, don't do anything. That's what this means. So you have the minimum movement per axis, and then we have the maximum correction time of 2,500 milliseconds here for both RA and DEC. I believe on the Asiair was set to 2,000 milliseconds. But typically, you should start with just the defaults. And there's a cool thing that's available if you wish to. Under Tools, you have a guiding assistant there. That I will not go through it now because it really makes the video long and it really goes too much into the details. But you can actually use that. Let's say, let me start taking exposures using the double arrow there, just like with the ZWSI-Air. So I have my exposures there. I can select a star. I can see on the bottom right, I have SNR 53. So I definitely have a good SNR. And then I could start guiding. So I'm not going to do that right now, but once I start guiding, you'll be able to click the Start button there. And then at the end of this process, it will actually suggest you values for minimum motion, aggressiveness, etc., and you can apply them directly. That can be a very powerful tool. But for now, we're going to just keep things simple, and I am going to adjust the focus on my guide scope. And for that, I can just use my helical focuser and see what happens if I move it in one direction. The focus actually might have gotten a slight bit better, and now it's starting to get worse, right? So I have my exposures, and you can see the exposure time here is 1 second. By the way, if the screen is too dark, you can play with this slider there to make it brighter or darker. And that's just for visual purposes. It doesn't affect the guiding. And this looks like mostly the best that I can achieve. By the way, if you're using a guide scope, those are typically very inferior type of optics. So you might get some weird blooming around the stars. And that's something you just need to learn to ignore. If you're using an off-axis guider, in this case it's very good, but you might be seeing, instead of those very round stars, you could be seeing stars that are elongated, almost like comets. That's fine. PHD2 can deal with that without any issues. So don't worry about it. And now that we are ready, either we can select a single star, like I can here by just clicking on it, or I can click on this little auto select star icon. And you can see it has auto selected multiple stars, exactly as we would wish. You have a brain icon here as well. It contains advanced settings. In particular, you have global settings, which I typically don't really see the need to change. You have camera settings. In this particular area, the important thing, I would say, is the camera gain. If you see that with short exposures, let's say you want to take 1 second exposures, but you don't get enough stars, you can change the gain of the camera here to help there. In the guiding tab, you have some interesting stuff. And most of those parameters, I'm not going to go too much into details. You can leave them as is. The search region, it's when the guide star deviates from where it was, PHD2 will try to find it again within 15 pixels. That's what this means. The HFD is half flux diameter. It's basically the size of the star as perceived by PHD2. And this tells PHD2 that it will only look at stars that are larger than 1.5 pixels, but smaller than 10 pixels. Then you have the auto-find thing, that little function that I used here, this little star there. And this is the star signal to noise ratio, the minimum one you want to use. That's fine. And then you have use multiple stars there. That should always be checked. I don't see any reason why you would not check that. After that, we have here the calibration step. Remember that? We saw that for the Asiair. This is exactly the same thing, except that if you click on advanced, you can basically have it will actually calibrate or find what your ideal calibration step should be. And you can click on OK and it will set it. So it can be more automated than the Asiair. You have auto restore calibration, so that's so you only need to calibrate once, and then you can reuse that again and again and again and again. And then most of those parameters you can ignore. The only thing that you should not ignore is this reverse deck output after meridian flip, which actually I need to be on for my mount, so I'll definitely enable it. But this is exactly what I mentioned for the Asiair. It depends on the mount that you have. Most mounts require this to be off. This particular mount requires it to be on. And then in the algorithm tab, you have the algorithms that will be used to guide in right ascension and in declination. Typically, you want to leave them alone. There is one thing, if you're using a worm gear mount, it might make sense to change this hysteresis to, what is it? Predictive periodic error correction, or predictive PEC. I have another video in the topic. If you're interested, I'll put it somewhere down in the description. But otherwise, you typically want to let those settings be. And now I'm going to select the stars again because somehow they've deviated. I'm not sure why. And now we can actually start guiding, clicking on that green button there. And what it's going to do is it's calibrating, and see west step, exactly like we saw with the Asiair. So we let it do its job, we let it be, and you can see the stars are actually deviating away from their green circle, and this is because the guiding procedure is actually moving them away. And now it's done west. I think it did less than 12 steps, so we could actually reduce the calibration step, but that's fine. I think we're good enough. And now it's doing the north step, so we'll probably have 10 to 11 steps there, which is perfectly good enough for a calibration, and we let it be. By the way, we also have another tool that's available, which is a calibration assistant. If you do your calibration within that, by just clicking on slew, then calibrate, you'll get the best possible calibration that you can reuse again and again and again. Okay, here we got a message there. Rates vary. You can look at the details. This is what the guiding results were. And yeah, we have some weird outliers. I think that's the issue. And that's me being right next to the mount, moving around, talking around, and basically making my balcony vibrate. So that's not a big deal. A lot of the time, actually, PHD2, especially recent versions, they tend to be a bit paranoid about all of that. And yeah, it's fine. Most of the time you can ignore it. And now we get the chart that you guys are used to. We've seen that. We know what that is. And we have on the left-hand side here the guiding results. So right ascension, declination, and the total is 0.6. So currently it seems to be guiding very, very well, even though I'm gesticulating right next to the mount. So well done, mount, for not being too vibrated by me and by my awesome presence. Now, there is one thing, and just as I say that, I move, and yeah, okay. There is one thing that is not in there. It's like dither every X frames. We had that in the Asiair. We had like those dither settlement parameters, all of that kind of stuff. And so where do you do that? Not in PHD2, actually. You do that in your imaging software, which for me is Nina. So I need to go to Equipment. I need to go to Guider. I need to select PHD2, and I need to click Connect. And now it is connected to PHD2, and you can see it is actually getting data from PHD2, exactly the same thing as what we see in the curve there. So you can monitor your PHD2 thing directly from your imaging software. And there you can see you have your dither pixels, except that you can set them, let's say, to 20. And you can see what this does. The camera dither pixels will be 21.15 pixels. So Nina, in this case, calculates the number of pixels that the main camera will move by, so you don't need to do those computations manually, as I had to do earlier with the Asiair. Ideally, by the way, you want to have a relationship where you have a fraction that's available, so 23.3 is not bad, but I'm trying to find a good compromise where, yeah, 25.4. I want to have like a large decimal fraction there, something like 0.5 would be ideal. 0.4 is something I'm going to take. This makes eventual drizzling based on your dithering work better. So that's what I can use. And I have all of the other settlement stuff, like the settled pixel tolerance. Okay, if it's less than 3 pixels for 10 seconds, then you can start the next exposure. But we have a timeout of 40 seconds, in which case just start your exposure forcefully. So that's the kind of options that you get. They're not part of PHD2. They're part of the imaging software, because the imaging software is what takes care of the main imaging camera. And in Nina, the dither every X frames is actually set at the sequence level. And for me, I have it, where do I have it? Here it is, dither after X exposures. I can just set it as I wish in there. And that's actually more powerful than the Asiair, because it's not a global setting. It's a setting that I can change per filter. Because typically if I take like short exposures with a luminance filter, I'll want to dither every 5, 10 frames. But if I'm doing narrowband imaging, I'll want to dither every frame. So I can isolate that with Nina. And that's basically what I have for the PC side of things. I think it's working pretty well. And the guiding is working well. Again, if you can look at the curve and see if you have some weird symptoms, like, okay, declination never manages to go back to the baseline. Maybe you need to increase the declination aggressiveness. RA never goes back to the center line. Maybe you need to increase the RA aggressiveness. RA keeps having like a sawtooth pattern around the baseline. Maybe we need to decrease the aggressiveness. That kind of stuff that can be changed. And this is basically what I wanted to cover in this guiding manual, this guiding primer, to get you really started, and more than started, getting you to an advanced level about guiding. So now you are able to guide with a guide scope, with an off-axis guider, or with a camera that has the integrated guide chip. And the world is your oyster. You can do whatever you want now. It is very powerful as a tool. Let me know what you think of what I said, and if you have further tips and tricks, let me know down in the comments. While you're going there, please like the video. If you're new to the channel, you may consider subscribing. And if you want to support me and my work, because as you can tell, this was a huge amount of work for this video, and you're planning on buying anything from Amazon, Agena, High Point Scientific, ZW, First Light Optics, etc. If you do so after clicking the links that I have in the description, it will help me out at no cost to you. You can also sponsor the channel as a channel member or a Patreon supporter. For Patreon, you can use my link down in the description. For channel member, it's the join button next to the subscribe button. You guys make the channel possible. And my Patreon members, channel members, have their credits at the end of long videos. Plus, some ranks of my Patreon members have access to my videos early and without ads. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for your support, as always. I hope this was useful. Don't forget, whenever you can, to look up at the stars, and I'll see you next time.